Hey everyone. Tonight we embark upon a journey into the deepest shadows of the ancient galaxy, where legends whisper of a Sith Lord whose mastery transcended mere power. This is the story of Tulak Hord, the Lord of Hate, whose blade never knew defeat and whose shadow servants chose eternal loyalty over freedom. A tale of perfect technique, impossible bonds, and mysteries that even the Sith themselves could not fully comprehend. Long ago in the mists of galactic history, when the Sith Empire stretched across star systems like a crimson tapestry woven from conquest and dark knowledge, there arose a legend that would echo through millennia. His name was spoken in hushed reverence, even by those who served the darkness. Tulak Hord, the Lord of Hate, master of the gathering darkness. But what made this ancient Sith Lord different from all others who claimed dominion over the galaxy? Why do the tombs of Korriban still whisper his name with something approaching reverence rather than fear? The answer lies not in conquest or political machination, but in something far more mysterious and profound. Picture, if you will, the Valley of the Dark Lords on Korriban, where ancient stone sentinels guard secrets older than the Republic itself. Among these monuments to power and ambition stands one tomb that draws pilgrims not seeking to plunder, but to learn. For within its shadowed halls, guardians wait who chose their vigil, not from compulsion, but from devotion, so absolute it transcended death itself. These guardians are not droids or enslaved spirits, but living beings of flesh and shadow, the Dashade. Warriors from a species naturally resistant to the Force, who could have served any master they chose, who could have claimed independence in a galaxy that feared their abilities. Yet they remain, generation after generation, protecting the legacy of one Sith Lord above all others. What could inspire such loyalty? What manner of master could earn the voluntary servitude of beings who bow to no Force user, who recognize no authority save that which they freely give? This is the mystery that haunts Sith historians and challenges everything we think we know about power, mastery, and the nature of the dark side itself. For you see, Tulak Hord was never betrayed by an ambitious apprentice, as was the fate of so many Dark Lords. He was never overthrown in some political coup or felled by treachery in the night. His death came under circumstances so unusual, so contrary to Sith tradition, that even now, thousands of years later, scholars debate what truly happened in those final days. But perhaps the greatest mystery lies not in how he died, but in how he lived. Ancient texts speak of a Sith Lord who taught that hatred could be refined like a blade, sharpened to perfect precision, rather than wielded as a crude bludgeon. They tell of training grounds where Force users learned techniques from beings who could not feel the Force, where the impossible became routine, where mastery was pursued not for its own sake, but for something higher. There are fragments of accounts, scattered across forgotten archives, that speak of something unprecedented in Sith history. They describe a time when territories requested Tulak Hord's guidance rather than resisting his conquest. When defeated enemies became devoted students, when the mere mention of his name could end conflicts not through fear, but through the recognition of superiority so absolute that resistance became meaningless. Yet for all his legend, for all the whispered stories of his impossible skill with a lightsaber, of his philosophical innovations that influenced Sith thinking for millennia to come, Tulak Hord remains an enigma wrapped in shadow. The details of his early life, his true origins, even his birth name, all lost to deliberate secrecy or the cruel passage of time. What remains is the mystery of perfection achieved, of bonds forged between species that should have been impossible, of a legacy that survived not through fear or political maneuvering, but through something the Sith rarely understood, genuine respect earned through demonstrated excellence. Tonight we shall unravel this mystery together, piece by ancient piece, following the path from legend to truth, from whispered stories to historical reality. This is the tale of how one being transcended the limitations of his time, his culture, and perhaps even his own mortality, to become something more than a Sith Lord. He became a master whose shadow servants still guard his wisdom, waiting for those worthy to learn what it truly means to achieve perfection. In the days when the galaxy was young, and the Republic existed only as a distant dream in the minds of a few visionary worlds, there flourished a civilization that would cast shadows across history for millennia to come. The Sith Empire, in those ancient times, bore little resemblance to the political machinations and desperate power struggles that would later define it. This was the era of the pure Sith, when Korriban was not merely a tomb world haunted by ancient spirits, but a thriving heart of culture, learning, and dark enlightenment. The Red Sands did not yet know the weight of countless fallen empires, and the Valley of the Dark Lord served not as a graveyard for ambition, but as inspiration for achievement. In those days, the Sith understood something that their descendants would forget in their hunger for domination. They knew that true power came not from the crude application of Force lightning or the political manipulation of lesser beings, but from mastery itself. Each Dark Lord was expected to excel in specific arts, to push the boundaries of what was possible within their chosen disciplines. Some focused their energies on Sith alchemy, transmuting matter and life itself according to their will. Others delved deep into the mysteries of Force sorcery, bending reality through rituals that required decades to perfect. Still others devoted themselves to the manipulation of lesser species, building networks of influence that spanned star systems. But among all these specialized masters, there emerged one whose obsession would reshape the very foundation of what it meant to be Sith. His name, even then, was whispered with a mixture of awe and bewilderment, for his chosen path defied the conventional wisdom of his time. While other young Sith sought to master the Force in all its terrible aspects, this particular student focused his attention on something seemingly more mundane, the lightsaber, not as a symbol of authority or a tool of intimidation, but as an instrument of absolute precision, a means to achieve perfection in its purest form. The other Sith Lords found his dedication curious, even amusing. After all, what use was perfect swordsmanship when the Force could crush enemies from across a room, when lightning could burn away entire armies, when sorcery could bend the very fabric of space and time? Why spend years perfecting techniques that could be rendered meaningless by a sufficiently powerful Force push? But this young Sith saw something that others missed. He understood that the lightsaber was not merely a weapon, but a teacher. Every movement, every stance, every flowing combination of strikes required absolute focus, perfect balance between aggression and control, between passion and precision. In the discipline of the blade, he found a path to refining not just his physical capabilities, but his connection to the dark side itself. The ancient records speak of training sessions that lasted from dawn until the red sun of Korriban set behind the distant mountains, while his contemporaries studied dusty tomes or practiced elaborate Force techniques. He could be found in the practice halls, moving through forms with a dedication that bordered on obsession. His fellow students began to notice something unusual in their sparring sessions. He never relied on Force powers to achieve victory. No telekinetic throws, no lightning, no attempts to dominate his opponent's mind. Just blade work of steadily increasing sophistication, technique refined to such a degree that it seemed to approach artistry. Victory after victory accumulated, each one achieved through pure skill rather than raw power. His reputation began to spread beyond the training halls, drawing the attention of masters who had assumed his path was a dead end, a quaint obsession that would ultimately prove inadequate against true Sith power. They were wrong. As word of his abilities reached the ears of the most accomplished warriors on Korriban, challenges began to arrive from unexpected quarters. Seasoned Sith Lords, veterans of actual combat, decided to test this young perfectionist against the realities of life and death conflict. Each duel became a lesson in the difference between power and mastery. Opponents who opened with devastating force attacks found their lightning redirected by blade work so precise it seemed impossible. Warriors who attempted to overwhelm him with aggression discovered that perfect technique could turn their own momentum against them. Masters of telekinesis found that their abilities meant nothing against someone who could predict their intentions through pure combat instinct. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these confrontations was what happened afterward. Unlike the typical Sith response to defeat, which involved either death or plots of revenge, something unprecedented occurred. The defeated masters began to seek him out, not for renewed conflict, but for instruction. Here was something entirely new in Sith culture. Warriors laying aside their pride to learn from someone who had bested them fairly. The traditional response to superior skill was to find some way to neutralize it through cunning or treachery. Instead, these ancient masters found themselves drawn to understand how such perfection was possible. And he taught them, patiently, methodically, without the condescension that usually marked Sith instruction. He shared his insights into the connection between physical discipline and force mastery, demonstrated how perfect technique could amplify rather than replace supernatural abilities. Word began to spread throughout Sith space of a new kind of teacher, one whose lessons went far beyond mere swordsmanship. Students came not just from Korriban, but from the furthest reaches of Sith territory, drawn by stories of training that transformed not just fighting ability, but one's entire relationship with the dark side of the Force. Yet even as his reputation grew, mysteries began to accumulate around him. Training partners reported seeing shadows that moved independently during practice sessions. Strange sounds echoed from the halls where he worked alone, rhythms that seemed to suggest multiple participants despite his solitary practice schedule. Most curious of all were the occasional glimpses of figures that seemed somehow wrong, beings whose presence felt different from any known species. They moved with the fluid grace of trained warriors, yet seemed to bend light around themselves in ways that suggested mastery of stealth techniques unknown to Sith training. When questioned about these anomalies, he would only smile and speak of learning opportunities that existed beyond the conventional boundaries of Sith knowledge. He hinted at discoveries that challenged everything the Sith thought they knew about combat, about the Force itself, about the nature of mastery and dedication. The mystery deepened, and with it, the legend began to take shape of the one who would become known as Tulak Hord, Lord of Hate, Master of the Gathering Darkness, and the greatest lightsaber duelist the galaxy had ever known. Something profound was emerging in the training halls of Korriban, a transformation that would challenge every assumption the Sith held about the nature of the dark side itself. As this mysterious master's reputation grew, so too did whispers about his unconventional teachings, particularly his radical interpretation of what it meant to embrace hatred as a source of power. The Sith Code spoke of passion as the key to strength, of using emotions like anger and hatred as fuel for Force abilities. For generations, this had been understood in the most literal sense. Young Sith were taught to nurture their rage, to let fury consume them in combat, to channel pure emotional chaos into devastating attacks. The stronger the emotion, the more powerful the result. Yet those who trained under this enigmatic master discovered something entirely different. He taught that hatred, like any tool, could be refined and perfected. Raw anger was the mark of an amateur, he explained. True mastery came from understanding hatred so completely that it became as precise as a surgeon's blade. During meditation sessions that lasted deep into Korriban's crimson nights, he would guide students through exercises designed to explore the very architecture of their emotions. Rather than simply feeding their anger until it blazed beyond control, they learned to examine it, to understand its structure and purpose, to shape it according to their will. He spoke of hatred as the galaxy's most honest emotion, the one feeling that could never truly lie to you about your circumstances. Fear could deceive you into seeing threats that didn't exist. Love could blind you to obvious dangers. Even anger could be misdirected toward the wrong targets. But hatred, when properly understood, revealed the exact nature of what needed to be changed, destroyed, or overcome. His students learned to distinguish between different types of hatred with the same precision that master chefs could identify subtle flavors in complex dishes. There was the hatred born of personal injury, which could fuel individual determination, but often led to narrow thinking. There was the hatred of injustice, which could motivate sweeping changes but sometimes sacrificed innocent bystanders. Most powerful of all was what he called philosophical hatred, the deep loathing of concepts and systems that prevented the achievement of perfection. This philosophical hatred became the cornerstone of his teaching. It wasn't personal animosity toward specific individuals, though such feelings certainly had their place in a warrior's development. Instead, it was a carefully cultivated disgust with mediocrity, with half measures, with the acceptance of anything less than absolute excellence. Under his guidance, students discovered that this refined hatred could enhance their focus to extraordinary degrees. Where raw anger might fuel a powerful but clumsy attack, philosophical hatred enabled strikes of surgical precision. Where blind fury could exhaust a warrior in minutes, controlled loathing could sustain peak performance for hours. The implications went far beyond lightsaber combat. Students found that their force abilities became more reliable, more subtle, more devastating when channeled through this disciplined emotional state. Telekinetic manipulations gained microscopic precision. Force lightning could be modulated to exact specifications. Even more complex abilities like force persuasion became dramatically more effective when powered by hatred so pure it transcended personal grievance. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his teaching was how it affected the relationships between his students. Traditional Sith training encouraged competition so vicious it often resulted in actual murder among classmates. Advancement came through eliminating rivals, and trust was seen as a potentially fatal weakness. His approach created something unprecedented in Sith education. Students competed fiercely, yes, but their hatred was directed toward their own limitations rather than toward each other. They pushed one another to greater heights not out of desire to humiliate opponents, but from a shared loathing of mediocrity that made settling for second best intolerable. Training sessions became collaborative efforts to achieve collective perfection. Students would spend hours analyzing each other's techniques, offering brutal but constructive criticism, working together to eliminate every flaw and inefficiency they could identify. The hatred they cultivated made them intolerant of weakness, but this intolerance extended most severely to weaknesses in themselves. Word of these innovations began to attract attention from the highest levels of Sith society. Dark Lords who had ruled through fear and intimidation for decades found themselves curious about methods that produced such obviously superior results. Some came as observers, others as skeptics determined to expose what they assumed must be some elaborate deception. What they witnessed in those training halls challenged everything they thought they knew about Sith nature. Here were students who radiated dark side energy more intensely than many full Sith Lords, yet displayed a level of discipline and cooperative focus that seemed almost alien to traditional Sith culture. The skeptics launched challenges, demanding practical demonstrations of these supposedly superior methods. They brought their most accomplished warriors, veterans of countless battles, masters of techniques honed through decades of real combat experience. The results were both educational and humbling. Time after time, these seasoned warriors found themselves outmatched not by superior force powers or exotic techniques, but by opponents who simply made fewer mistakes. Students who had trained under the new methods displayed a consistency of performance that seemed almost mechanical in its precision, yet flowed with an organic grace that spoke of deep understanding rather than mere repetition. More disturbing to the traditional Sith was the attitude these students displayed toward victory and defeat. Winners showed no gloating. No savage satisfaction in their opponent's humiliation. Losers demonstrated no shame, no desire for revenge. Both sides analyzed each encounter with clinical detachment, focused entirely on extracting lessons that could improve future performance. This emotional discipline proved even more unsettling than their combat abilities. Here were Sith who had clearly embraced the dark side completely, whose connection to its power was undeniably strong, yet who seemed immune to the chaos and instability that usually accompanied such devotion. They had found a way to be passionate without being reckless, to embrace hatred without losing their sanity. Ancient philosophical texts spoke of the theoretical possibility of such development, but most Sith scholars had dismissed these passages as impossible idealism. The dark side was meant to be wild, unpredictable, barely controlled. The notion that it could be tamed so completely while retaining its power seemed to contradict the fundamental nature of the Force itself. Yet here was proof that such mastery was not only possible but practical. Students trained in these methods consistently outperformed traditionally educated Sith in every measurable category. Their technique was superior, their endurance greater, their tactical thinking more sophisticated, and perhaps most importantly, their psychological stability far more reliable. The Master himself remained enigmatic throughout this period of growing recognition. He accepted the respect offered by visiting dignitaries with quiet grace, answered questions about his methods with patient thoroughness, but revealed virtually nothing about his own background or the sources of his innovations. Those closest to him began to notice subtle changes in his routine. Training sessions sometimes included exercises that seemed designed for multiple participants, yet he often practiced alone. Strange sounds echoed from sealed chambers, rhythmic patterns that suggested coordinated movement but involved no visible partners. Most intriguingly, students occasionally glimpsed figures moving in perfect synchronization with their master during advanced demonstrations. These shadowy forms seemed substantial enough to block strikes and execute complex maneuvers, yet displayed properties that defied easy explanation. They moved with fluid precision that rivaled or exceeded the master's own abilities, yet seemed somehow incomplete, as if existing partially in some other dimension. When questioned about these phenomena, he would only speak of learning opportunities that existed beyond conventional understanding, of teachers who could offer insights unavailable through traditional Sith methods. He hinted at discoveries that challenged the very boundaries between possible and impossible, between known and unknown. The mystery deepened with each passing day, and with it grew the legend of the one who would soon claim a title that would echo through history. The foundations were being laid for something unprecedented in Sith culture, a legacy built not on conquest or political manipulation, but on the pursuit of perfection so absolute it would transcend the limitations of mortality itself. Beyond the established borders of Sith space, where star charts became uncertain and navigation required both skill and courage, lay territories that even the most ambitious Dark Lords had deemed unworthy of conquest. These regions harbored worlds too primitive to offer technological advancement, too resource-poor to justify military expeditions, too dangerous for casual exploration. Yet it was precisely toward these forgotten corners of the galaxy that our enigmatic master turned his attention as his reputation on Korriban reached its zenith. While other Sith Lords competed for control of established trade routes and populated systems, he commissioned vessels designed for deep space exploration, seeking something that existing Sith territories could not provide. His stated purpose was the investigation of ancient Force phenomena, the search for artifacts and knowledge from civilizations that predated even the earliest Sith records. Critics within the established hierarchy dismissed this as eccentric academic pursuit, the hobby of someone who had grown bored with practical concerns. They failed to understand that his quest was far more focused and purposeful than casual scholarly interest. What he sought were fighting techniques that had developed independently of Force traditions, combat methods refined by species who had never known the touch of supernatural power. His philosophical approach to hatred had taught him that perfection required understanding all possible perspectives, not just those available within familiar cultural boundaries. The expeditions he launched were marvels of preparation and planning. Rather than the massive fleets traditionally employed for Sith conquests, he utilized small, highly advanced vessels capable of extended autonomous operation. Each ship carried exhaustive databases of known fighting techniques, recording equipment designed to capture and analyze previously unknown combat methods, and most importantly, translation devices sophisticated enough to facilitate communication with completely alien cultures. His crews were selected not for their political connections or force sensitivity, but for their expertise in xenobiology, linguistics, and cultural analysis. He understood that successful first contact with unknown species would require diplomatic finesse rather than military intimidation, patience rather than aggression. The early expeditions yielded fascinating but ultimately disappointing results. Ancient ruins provided glimpses of extinct civilizations, some with combat traditions of considerable sophistication. Primitive species displayed fighting techniques adapted to their unique physiologies and environments. Yet none of these discoveries offered the quantum leap in understanding that he sought. Everything changed during the seventh expedition, when long-range sensors detected unusual energy signatures emanating from a world that appeared uninhabited. According to all conventional scans, the planet showed no signs of technological civilization, no electromagnetic emissions, no evidence of spacefaring capability. Yet something about the sensor readings suggested organized activity on a scale that indicated intelligent life. Landing parties equipped with the most advanced stealth technology available found themselves in an environment that challenged every assumption about the relationship between intelligence and detectability. The world's surface appeared pristine, unmarked by construction or agriculture, yet careful observation revealed subtle signs of purposeful modification. Vegetation grew in patterns too regular to be natural, suggesting deliberate cultivation designed to appear wild. Water sources had been redirected through underground channels that required sophisticated engineering, yet left no visible traces on the surface. Most remarkably, the very air seemed to bend around certain areas, creating zones of visual distortion that could only be the result of advanced camouflage techniques. For weeks, the exploration teams documented these phenomena without encountering any inhabitants. The evidence of intelligence was overwhelming, yet the beings responsible for these modifications remained completely invisible. Traditional detection methods failed utterly, suggesting either technology far in advance of Sith capabilities or natural abilities that defied conventional understanding. The breakthrough came not through superior equipment or clever tactics, but through patient observation of the planet's rhythms. The exploration teams established hidden monitoring posts and waited, documenting the subtle changes that occurred in their environment over extended periods. Gradually, patterns emerged. Certain areas showed signs of regular use despite appearing completely empty. Disturbances in vegetation suggested the passage of invisible beings following established routes. Most intriguingly, some of the team's equipment began to malfunction in specific locations, as if affected by some form of natural interference. When contact finally occurred, it was initiated by the planet's inhabitants rather than the Sith explorers. One moment the landing party was alone in what appeared to be an empty clearing. The next they found themselves surrounded by figures that seemed to emerge from the very shadows themselves. The beings revealed were unlike anything in Sith experience, humanoid in basic structure, yet adapted for capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. Their skin seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating the visual impression of mobile patches of darkness, even in broad daylight. Their movements displayed the fluid grace of master assassins combined with the impossible silence of creatures that had evolved to be undetectable. Most remarkable of all was their apparent immunity to force perception. Sith explorers, accustomed to sensing the thoughts and emotions of other beings, found these creatures completely opaque to supernatural detection. They existed in what could only be described as Force shadows, present and substantial, yet somehow invisible to the mystical senses that most Sith relied upon for situational awareness. Communication proved challenging, but not impossible. The beings possessed intelligence clearly equal to any known species, sophisticated understanding of technology, despite their apparent lack of advanced tools, and most importantly, recognition of the Sith explorers' combat training. Through painstaking translation efforts, the first exchanges revealed a culture built entirely around concepts of honor, skill, and service. These beings, who called themselves Dashade, valued martial excellence above all other achievements. Their entire social structure revolved around the identification and protection of individuals who demonstrated superior combat abilities. What emerged through these early conversations was both fascinating and unprecedented. The Dashade explained that their species had evolved on a world where survival required perfect stealth and flawless fighting technique. Their natural force immunity had developed as protection against predators that hunted through supernatural senses. Their shadow-bending abilities were biological adaptations that allowed them to become effectively invisible to most forms of detection. But perhaps most significantly, they had developed a cultural philosophy that prized service to proven masters above personal independence. Unlike most warrior cultures that emphasized individual achievement, the Dashade found their greatest fulfillment in protecting and serving those whose skills exceeded their own. The implications of this revelation struck the Sith Master immediately. Here was a species naturally equipped for the perfect bodyguard role, possessed of abilities that could complement Force powers rather than competing with them, and culturally predisposed to loyalty rather than betrayal. Yet he understood that earning their respect would require demonstrating the very qualities they valued most. The Dashade would never serve someone they considered inferior, regardless of political authority or supernatural power. Their allegiance could only be won through proven excellence in combat, tactical thinking, and leadership. What followed were weeks of careful negotiation punctuated by increasingly complex demonstrations of skill. The Dashade tested not just fighting ability, but strategic thinking, ethical consistency, and commitment to the principles of mastery that formed the core of their cultural identity. These tests revealed that his years of philosophical development had prepared him for exactly this opportunity. His approach to hatred as refined discipline rather than chaotic emotion resonated with their appreciation for controlled precision. His commitment to perfection over mere victory aligned with their values in ways that transcended species boundaries. The Dashade recognized in him something they had never encountered before, a Force user whose dedication to mastery exceeded even their own legendary standards. His willingness to learn from non-Force techniques, to incorporate their methods into his own training, demonstrated the kind of open-minded excellence they considered the highest possible achievement. When the first group of Dashade volunteers requested permission to accompany him back to Sith space, it marked the beginning of a partnership that would reshape both cultures. The Shadow Warriors had found a master worthy of their absolute loyalty, while he had discovered teachers whose abilities could elevate his already extraordinary skills to truly legendary levels. The return journey to Korriban would prove to be far more than a simple voyage home. It would become the foundation period for innovations in combat technique that would influence galactic history for millennia to come. The return to Korriban marked the beginning of the most revolutionary period in Sith combat development since the creation of the lightsaber itself. What had begun as one master's quest for perfection evolved into a transformation that would influence fighting techniques across the galaxy for thousands of years. The training halls that had once echoed with familiar sounds of traditional Sith practice now resonated with something entirely new. Where previously students had relied primarily on Force-enhanced techniques, now they learned to integrate methods developed by beings who had never known supernatural abilities. The synthesis of these approaches created possibilities that neither culture could have achieved independently. Working alongside his Dashade companions, the Master began developing combat forms that challenged every assumption about lightsaber technique. Traditional Sith fighting emphasized overwhelming aggression backed by force powers, the philosophy being that supernatural abilities could compensate for any tactical deficiencies. This approach worked well against conventional opponents, but created dependencies that could prove fatal when facing unexpected challenges. The Dashade brought a completely different perspective to combat. Their natural force immunity had required them to develop fighting methods based purely on physical excellence, tactical thinking, and environmental awareness. They could not rely on supernatural perception to anticipate attacks or force powers to enhance their speed and strength. Every technique had to be perfect because there was no mystical safety net to compensate for mistakes. This fundamental difference in approach created training opportunities that were as challenging as they were enlightening. Sparring sessions between Force users and Dashade warriors forced both sides to expand their understanding of combat beyond their natural comfort zones. The Sith students learned that many techniques they had considered fundamental were actually inefficient dependencies on supernatural abilities. Attacks that seemed perfectly executed often contained subtle flaws that became obvious when facing opponents who could not be influenced by force suggestion or intimidation. Defensive positions that felt secure proved vulnerable to assault methods that bypassed mystical detection entirely. Meanwhile, the Dashade discovered that their techniques could be dramatically enhanced when performed by beings capable of force augmentation. Movements that required years of conditioning to execute properly could be achieved immediately when enhanced by supernatural reflexes. Stealth techniques that demanded perfect environmental awareness became nearly impossible to counter when combined with force-based perception. The synthesis of these approaches produced fighting forms that were unprecedented in their versatility and effectiveness. Students trained in these hybrid methods could adapt seamlessly between force-enhanced combat against supernatural opponents and pure technique when facing beings immune to mystical influence. But the innovations went far beyond simple technique combination. The Master's philosophical approach to hatred provided the conceptual framework needed to integrate these diverse methods into coherent fighting systems. His understanding of controlled emotion as a precision tool allowed students to maintain the focus required for Dashade-style technique while accessing the power available through dark side connection. The results became apparent during demonstration matches that drew observers from across Sith space. Traditional masters who came expecting to witness interesting but ultimately impractical innovations instead found themselves witnessing displays of combat excellence that exceeded anything in their experience. Duels that should have ended quickly with decisive force attacks instead became extended exhibitions of tactical brilliance. Students demonstrated the ability to neutralize opponents' supernatural advantages through pure skill, while simultaneously exploiting their own force abilities in ways that seemed to transcend normal limitations. Perhaps most impressive was the psychological impact of these techniques on opponents. Traditional Sith combat relied heavily on intimidation and fear as tactical weapons. The dark side radiated menace that could break an opponent's concentration before the first blow was struck. However, warriors trained in the new methods projected something far more unsettling than simple menace. They radiated competence so absolute it approached the supernatural. Opponents found themselves facing beings who seemed incapable of making mistakes, whose every movement demonstrated such perfect understanding of combat principles that resistance felt futile. This was not the psychological warfare of fear and intimidation, but the far more devastating demoralization that came from recognizing genuinely superior skill. Word of these innovations spread throughout the Sith Empire with remarkable speed. Masters who had initially dismissed the hybrid techniques as academic curiosities began requesting detailed information about training methods and philosophical principles. Some came seeking to incorporate selected elements into their existing programs, while others requested complete retraining for themselves and their students. The demand for instruction grew beyond anything that could be accommodated through traditional teaching methods. In response, the master began developing standardized training protocols that could be implemented across multiple locations simultaneously. These programs required careful adaptation to account for varying skill levels and cultural backgrounds, but the core principles remained consistent. The establishment of affiliated training centers throughout Sith space created a network of schools that shared common philosophical foundations while adapting techniques to local needs and preferences. Each center was staffed by masters who had completed intensive certification programs that ensured consistency of instruction across the entire system. But perhaps the most significant development was the creation of advanced training facilities specifically designed for integrated Force user and Dashade instruction. These centers featured environmental chambers that could simulate a vast range of combat conditions, from the force-dampening effects of certain minerals to the sensory challenges of complete darkness or blinding light. Students at these facilities learned to fight effectively, regardless of environmental conditions or opponent capabilities. They developed the ability to transition seamlessly between force-enhanced and purely physical combat methods, depending on tactical requirements. Most importantly, they learned to view supernatural abilities as tools to be used precisely rather than crutches to compensate for inadequate technique. The Dashade warriors who served as instructors in these programs brought more than just fighting techniques to the curriculum. Their cultural emphasis on honor, service, and dedication to mastery influenced the philosophical development of their students in ways that extended far beyond combat training. Traditional Sith education emphasized individual advancement through competition and elimination of rivals. Students were taught to view classmates as potential enemies and to seek advancement through any means necessary. This approach produced powerful individuals but also created fundamental instability within Sith society, as ambitious students constantly plotted against masters and each other. The Dashade perspective introduced concepts of collective excellence and mutual support that transformed the learning environment. Students discovered that helping classmates achieve their potential accelerated their own development rather than hindering it. The pursuit of perfect technique required honest feedback and collaborative problem-solving that made traditional backstabbing counterproductive. This cultural shift had profound implications for Sith society as a whole. Graduates of the new training programs displayed loyalty patterns and cooperative behaviors that were unprecedented in Sith history. They formed lasting partnerships based on mutual respect and shared commitment to excellence rather than temporary alliances motivated by political convenience. The master himself became the embodiment of these revolutionary changes. His reputation as an undefeated duelist was matched by recognition as an innovative teacher whose methods produced consistently superior results. Students who completed training under his direct supervision achieved success rates in both combat and leadership roles that exceeded traditional Sith averages by dramatic margins. Yet for all his growing fame and influence, he remained focused on the pursuit of even greater perfection. The integration of Dashade techniques had revealed new possibilities for combat development that demanded continued exploration and refinement. Each successful innovation opened pathways to further advancement that beckoned with the promise of even more extraordinary achievements. The ancient records speak of training sessions during this period that approached the realm of legend, demonstrations of techniques so perfect they seemed to bend the laws of physics, combinations of force powers and physical skills that created effects no single approach could achieve, displays of tactical brilliance that reduced complex battles to exercises in applied artistry. Witnesses described duels where every movement seemed choreographed, yet spontaneous, where opponents moved with such synchronized precision that combat became a form of deadly dance. The integration of Dashade stealth techniques with force abilities created fighting methods that allowed warriors to attack from directions that seemed impossible, to disappear and reappear with timing so perfect it appeared supernatural even to other force users. Perhaps most remarkably, these innovations proved effective not just in controlled training environments, but in actual combat situations. Reports began filtering back from various conflicts throughout Sith space, describing engagements where traditionally trained forces found themselves completely outmatched by opponents using unfamiliar techniques. The master's reputation evolved from that of an innovative teacher to recognition as a tactical genius whose methods could determine the outcome of entire campaigns. Military leaders began requesting his advice on strategy and training, while political figures sought to secure the services of warriors trained in his techniques. As his influence expanded throughout Sith space, the foundation was being laid for something unprecedented in galactic history. The combination of perfect technique, revolutionary philosophy, and loyal Dashade allies was creating the conditions for a form of leadership that transcended traditional concepts of political power. The stage was set for the emergence of a Dark Lord whose authority would rest not on fear or manipulation, but on demonstrated excellence so absolute that service became privilege rather than burden. The transformation from innovative teacher to recognized Dark Lord came not through political machination or violent overthrow, but through something far more profound and lasting. As word of his revolutionary methods spread throughout Sith space, entire star systems began requesting his guidance in matters that extended far beyond combat training. What emerged was a form of leadership that the galaxy had never witnessed before. Traditional Dark Lords ruled through intimidation, maintaining power by ensuring that subjects feared the consequences of disobedience more than they valued freedom. This approach created unstable hierarchies where rebellion was always simmering beneath the surface, where succession involved devastating civil wars, and where the death of a leader often meant the collapse of entire governmental structures. His approach represented a complete departure from these established patterns. Rather than demanding submission through fear, he earned respect through demonstrated competence. Territories under his guidance prospered not because they were forced to contribute to his wealth, but because his methods actually improved their circumstances. The philosophical framework he had developed for combat training proved equally applicable to broader social and economic challenges. The same principles that created perfect lightsaber technique could be applied to agricultural efficiency, industrial optimization, and administrative effectiveness. His emphasis on eliminating waste and maximizing precision translated directly into improvements in virtually every aspect of civilized life. Agricultural worlds that implemented his management techniques experienced unprecedented crop yields. The systematic approach he advocated for identifying and correcting inefficiencies resulted in food production increases that transformed subsistence-level colonies into exporters of surplus goods. These improvements came not through force manipulation or exploitation of workers, but through better understanding of natural processes and more effective resource allocation. Industrial centers that adopted his organizational methods achieved similar breakthroughs in manufacturing efficiency. The same attention to detail that characterized his combat training proved invaluable in identifying production bottlenecks and developing solutions that increased output while reducing waste. Factories that had struggled to meet basic quotas found themselves exceeding targets by margins that seemed impossible under previous management approaches. Perhaps most remarkably, these improvements were achieved without the brutal working conditions that typically characterized Sith industrial operations. His philosophy emphasized that perfect technique required healthy, motivated practitioners, whether they were wielding lightsabers or operating manufacturing equipment. Workers who understood their role in larger processes and felt valued for their contributions consistently outperformed those driven by fear alone. The Dashade presence in his territories added another dimension to this transformation. Their natural abilities made them ideal for intelligence gathering and security operations, but they served in these roles as protectors rather than oppressors. Their cultural emphasis on honor and service created a form of law enforcement that was both more effective and more humane than traditional Sith methods. Crime rates plummeted in areas where Dashade warriors served as peacekeepers, but not because potential criminals feared harsh punishment. The Shadow Warriors' ability to detect and prevent crimes before they occurred created an environment where lawlessness simply became impractical. Their presence was so subtle that most citizens never saw them directly, yet so comprehensive that criminal activity became virtually impossible. This combination of economic prosperity and effective security created something unprecedented in Sith space: genuine loyalty from subject populations. People served not because they had no choice, but because they recognized that their lives were better under his guidance than they had been under previous rulers. Word of these innovations reached the attention of the established Dark Council, the collective leadership that had governed Sith space for generations. Initially, they viewed his methods with suspicion and concern. His success challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which their own authority rested. If territories could prosper under benevolent leadership, what did that say about the necessity of traditional Sith brutality? Some council members advocated for immediate action to eliminate what they saw as a dangerous precedent. They argued that allowing his methods to spread would undermine the entire foundation of Sith society, creating expectations that other leaders could not or would not meet. The traditional approach of ruling through fear would become impossible if subjects knew that alternatives existed. However, practical considerations prevented any decisive action against him. His territories were the most prosperous and stable in Sith space, contributing more to the overall economy than entire sectors under traditional management. His military forces, trained in his revolutionary techniques, had proven superior to conventional Sith armies in every engagement. Most importantly, any attempt to remove him would likely result in the loss of his innovations and a return to the instability that had plagued those regions before his arrival. The solution that emerged was both pragmatic and unprecedented. Rather than attempting to eliminate his influence, the Dark Council formally recognized his authority over his territories while requesting that he share his knowledge with other sectors facing similar challenges. This arrangement allowed them to benefit from his innovations while maintaining the fiction that traditional Sith methods remained supreme. His response to this recognition revealed the depth of his understanding of both politics and human nature. Rather than demanding formal titles or ceremonial recognition, he focused on expanding opportunities to implement his methods across wider areas. He accepted the informal designation of Dark Lord, not as personal aggrandizement, but as a tool that would allow him to effect more comprehensive improvements throughout Sith space. The establishment of his formal authority coincided with an intensification of his archaeological and historical research efforts. Having achieved practical success with his innovations, he turned his attention to understanding how his discoveries fit into the broader context of Sith development and galactic history. Expeditions launched from his territories began uncovering evidence of ancient civilizations that had achieved remarkable levels of technological and social development before disappearing from historical records. These discoveries suggested that the techniques he had developed were not entirely novel, but rather represented the rediscovery of principles that had been known and applied by earlier cultures. The implications of these findings were profound. If advanced civilizations had risen and fallen before, leaving only fragmentary traces of their achievements, then current galactic society might be operating far below its potential. The techniques that had transformed his territories from struggling colonies into prosperous centers of excellence might represent just the beginning of what could be accomplished through systematic application of proper principles. His Dashade companions proved invaluable in these archaeological efforts. Their natural stealth abilities allowed them to explore dangerous ruins that would have been inaccessible to conventional survey teams. Their force immunity protected them from ancient security measures that relied on mystical detection or influence. Most importantly, their warrior culture gave them an instinctive understanding of the martial aspects of extinct civilizations that other researchers might have overlooked. Together, they began piecing together a picture of galactic history that was far more complex and sophisticated than conventional scholarship suggested. Ancient star maps revealed trade routes that connected civilizations separated by vast distances. Technological artifacts demonstrated engineering principles that current science considered impossible. Most intriguingly, combat techniques carved into stone tablets showed fighting methods that paralleled his own innovations with remarkable precision. These discoveries led to a fundamental shift in his understanding of his own role in galactic history. Rather than seeing himself as an innovator creating entirely new approaches, he began to recognize that he was actually serving as a bridge between ancient wisdom and contemporary application. His techniques worked not because they were revolutionary, but because they represented the rediscovery of principles that had proven effective across multiple civilizations and time periods. This realization transformed his approach to teaching and leadership. Instead of presenting his methods as personal innovations, he began framing them as the restoration of ancient knowledge that belonged to all sentient beings capable of understanding and applying it properly. This shift in perspective made his teachings more accessible to students from diverse cultural backgrounds, while simultaneously increasing their credibility within established academic and political circles. The territories under his guidance evolved into something resembling a renaissance of ancient knowledge and modern application. Universities emerged that combined practical training with historical research. Libraries were established that preserved both contemporary innovations and recovered ancient texts. Most importantly, a culture developed that valued learning and improvement as ongoing processes rather than fixed achievements. The Dashade integration into this cultural transformation proved to be one of its most remarkable aspects. Their oral traditions, which had preserved their people's history across millennia, provided insights into historical periods that had been completely lost to written records. Their warrior philosophy contributed depth and context to archaeological discoveries related to ancient combat techniques and military strategies. As his influence expanded and his understanding deepened, the foundation was being laid for achievements that would transcend even his already remarkable accomplishments. The combination of practical success, historical knowledge, and loyal allies was creating conditions for innovations that would influence galactic development for thousands of years to come. Success, particularly success achieved through methods that challenge established orthodoxy, inevitably creates resistance from those whose authority depends on maintaining the status quo. As his territories continued to flourish and his influence expanded throughout Sith space, powerful forces began to coalesce in opposition to what they perceived as a fundamental threat to traditional order. The resistance did not emerge from a single source or follow a coordinated plan. Instead, it developed organically from multiple centers of established power, each with their own reasons for viewing his innovations as dangerous precedents that needed to be contained or eliminated. Traditional Dark Lords found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position as their own subjects began questioning why their lives could not be as prosperous and secure as those in territories under his guidance. Populations that had previously accepted harsh treatment as an inevitable aspect of Sith rule now demanded explanations for policies that seemed arbitrary and counterproductive when compared to obviously superior alternatives. The economic implications of his success created additional pressures throughout Sith space. Regions that had implemented his methods were outcompeting traditional territories in virtually every measurable category. Their superior agricultural output was driving down food prices across multiple sectors. Their manufacturing efficiency was undercutting established industrial centers. Their economic prosperity was attracting skilled workers and investment capital that had previously supported other areas. This economic displacement created hardship for territories that continued to operate under traditional methods, hardship that their rulers blamed not on the inadequacy of their own approaches, but on the unfair advantages supposedly gained through his unconventional techniques. They argued that his methods violated fundamental Sith principles and that allowing them to continue would ultimately undermine the entire foundation of their civilization. The philosophical challenge posed by his approach proved even more threatening than the economic competition. Traditional Sith doctrine held that power necessarily corrupted, that authority could only be maintained through fear and intimidation, and that any attempt to rule through benevolence would inevitably lead to weakness and eventual overthrow. His sustained success contradicted these fundamental assumptions. Here was a Dark Lord whose power had grown rather than diminished through treating subjects well, whose authority had strengthened rather than weakened through sharing knowledge and resources, whose military forces had become more rather than less effective through training methods that emphasized cooperation over competition. The existence of such an alternative created cognitive dissonance throughout Sith society. If benevolent leadership was actually more effective than traditional brutality, then generations of Sith Lords had been wrong about the basic nature of power and authority. The implications of this possibility were so disturbing to established leaders that many chose to reject the evidence rather than question their fundamental beliefs. Religious and philosophical conservatives within Sith society added their voices to the growing opposition. They argued that his methods represented a corruption of ancient Sith traditions, a dilution of the pure dark side philosophy that had made their civilization strong. The integration of Dashade techniques and perspectives was characterized as contamination of Sith racial purity, while his emphasis on cooperation was denounced as weakness disguised as innovation. These ideological objections found support among Sith who felt that rapid social and economic changes were threatening their traditional way of life. Workers whose skills had become obsolete due to improved techniques, merchants whose businesses had been displaced by more efficient competitors, and bureaucrats whose positions had been eliminated through administrative streamlining, all had personal reasons to oppose continued transformation. The growing opposition began to organize around a core group of traditional Dark Lords who commanded significant military resources and maintained extensive networks of political allies. Their initial strategy focused on containment, attempting to prevent his methods from spreading to additional territories while building coalition support for more direct action. Diplomatic pressure was applied to neutral territories, warning them that adoption of his techniques would be viewed as hostile acts against established Sith authority. Economic sanctions were imposed on regions that traded extensively with his territories, attempting to isolate him from broader galactic commerce. Military exercises were conducted near his borders, demonstrating the superior numbers available to traditional forces while testing his responses to potential threats. His reaction to these provocations revealed the depth of his understanding of both military strategy and political dynamics. Rather than responding with defensive measures that might have been interpreted as signs of weakness or guilt, he continued implementing improvements and innovations as if the opposition simply did not exist. This approach proved psychologically devastating to his opponents. Their threats and demonstrations had been designed to force him into defensive postures that would limit his effectiveness while providing them with justifications for more aggressive action. Instead, they found themselves dealing with someone who appeared completely confident in his ability to handle any challenges they might present. The Dashade presence in his territories added another dimension to the strategic equation. Their intelligence-gathering capabilities provided him with detailed information about opposition plans and preparations, while their stealth abilities made it virtually impossible for enemies to obtain comparable intelligence about his own activities. More importantly, the Dashade cultural perspective on honor and conflict influenced his approach to the growing crisis. Rather than viewing the opposition as enemies to be destroyed, he saw them as adversaries whose challenge could provide opportunities for further growth and development. This attitude allowed him to maintain the moral high ground while preparing for conflicts that seemed increasingly inevitable. The philosophical framework he had developed for understanding perfect hatred proved invaluable in this context. Instead of allowing anger at his opponent's short-sightedness to cloud his judgment, he channeled his frustration into focused determination to prove the superiority of his methods through practical demonstration. His territories began implementing enhanced security measures that were both more effective and less intrusive than traditional approaches. Dashade warriors established intelligence networks that could detect and neutralize threats long before they materialized into actual attacks. Military training programs were expanded to include scenarios specifically designed to counter the tactics favored by traditional Sith forces. These preparations were conducted with characteristic efficiency and innovation. Rather than simply building larger armies or more powerful weapons, he focused on developing capabilities that would make traditional military approaches obsolete. His forces trained to fight as integrated units where Force users and Dashade warriors complemented each other's abilities, creating tactical combinations that conventional armies could not match. The economic development of his territories accelerated rather than slowing in response to external pressure. The threat of sanctions and isolation spurred innovations in self-sufficiency and alternative trade relationships. Industrial capacity expanded to reduce dependence on external suppliers. Agricultural techniques were refined to achieve even higher levels of productivity. Perhaps most significantly, the external pressure strengthened rather than weakened the loyalty of his subjects. Populations that might have taken prosperity for granted under peaceful conditions now recognized how much they had to lose if traditional Sith methods were reimposed. This recognition translated into unprecedented levels of popular support for his leadership and willing participation in defensive preparations. The combination of superior military capabilities, economic strength, and popular support created a situation that his opponents found increasingly frustrating. Their attempts at intimidation had backfired, strengthening rather than weakening his position. Their efforts at isolation had failed, as his territories became more rather than less self-sufficient. Their propaganda campaigns had been ineffective, as the obvious prosperity and security of his subjects spoke louder than any political rhetoric. As the opposition realized that conventional pressure tactics were not going to achieve their objectives, discussions began focusing on more direct approaches. The possibility of open military action gained support among those who felt that peaceful methods had been given adequate opportunity to succeed. The stage was being set for conflicts that would test not just military capabilities, but fundamental assumptions about the nature of power, leadership, and the future direction of Sith civilization. The coming trials would determine whether innovation and cooperation could prevail against tradition and force, whether the promise of a better future could overcome the inertia of established custom. The gathering storm would soon break with full fury, and its outcome would reshape the galaxy for generations to come. The confrontation, when it finally came, took a form that surprised even the most experienced political observers throughout Sith space. Rather than launching conventional military attacks or engaging in the kind of treacherous assassination attempts that typically characterized Sith power struggles, the opposition chose to challenge him through the most ancient and honored tradition of their culture. They invoked the right of trial by combat, a practice that dated back to the earliest days of Sith civilization. Under this ancient law, any Dark Lord could be challenged to prove his worthiness through single combat against opponents of his peers' choosing. The tradition had fallen into disuse over the centuries, largely because most political disputes were resolved through less formal violence long before they reached the point where such formal challenges became necessary. The decision to resurrect this ancient practice revealed both the desperation and the cunning of his opponents. They recognized that direct military action against his territories would likely fail, given his superior tactical capabilities and the loyalty of his subjects. Assassination attempts would be nearly impossible to execute successfully, thanks to his Dashade protectors and their supernatural stealth abilities. However, the right of trial by combat offered a solution that played to their perceived advantages. As a formal legal proceeding recognized throughout Sith space, it would be difficult for him to refuse without appearing to abandon the very traditions he claimed to represent. The challenges would be individual duels rather than large-scale battles, negating his advantages in military organization and popular support. Most importantly, the opposition believed that his philosophical approach to combat, with its emphasis on cooperation and systematic technique, would prove inadequate against warriors trained in the pure aggression and individual excellence that had characterized traditional Sith methods for generations. The formal announcement of the challenges created a sensation throughout the galaxy. Never before had a Dark Lord faced such a comprehensive test of his authority through ritual combat. The ancient precedent suggested that he would be required to face multiple opponents over an extended period, with each victory leading to increasingly difficult challenges until he was either defeated or proved his supremacy beyond any reasonable doubt. His response to the announcement demonstrated both the depth of his understanding of Sith law and his confidence in his own abilities. Rather than attempting to avoid or delay the trials, he formally accepted all challenges and requested that they be conducted as public events open to observation by representatives from throughout Sith space. This decision surprised his opponents, who had expected him to seek private venues where potential embarrassing defeats could be concealed from broader public awareness. By insisting on public trials, he transformed what was intended as a method of destroying his reputation into an opportunity to demonstrate his capabilities before the largest possible audience. The first challenger was a veteran Dark Lord, whose reputation had been built through decades of successful military campaigns and countless individual duels. His fighting style embodied the traditional Sith approach to combat, emphasizing overwhelming aggression backed by powerful Force abilities. He had never been defeated in single combat, and was confident that his experience and proven methods would expose the weaknesses he assumed must exist in his opponent's unconventional techniques. The duel itself became a masterclass in the difference between power and precision. The challenger opened with devastating Force lightning attacks that should have ended the combat within seconds. Instead, he found his energy redirected and absorbed by defensive techniques he had never encountered before. His telekinetic assaults were countered by movements so perfectly timed that they seemed to anticipate his intentions before he had fully formed them. What followed was a demonstration of lightsaber technique that left spectators struggling to comprehend what they were witnessing. Every strike was placed with surgical precision. Every defensive movement accomplished exactly what was needed with no wasted motion or energy. The challenger's aggressive style, which had overwhelmed countless previous opponents, was systematically dissected and neutralized by responses that seemed almost casual in their effectiveness. The duel concluded not with the dramatic finishing moves typical of such encounters, but with a moment of perfect technique that rendered further combat impossible. The challenger found himself in a position where any movement would result in fatal injury, yet he had suffered no significant wounds. He had been comprehensively defeated without being destroyed, a distinction that had never occurred to him as a possibility. The psychological impact of this victory extended far beyond the immediate participants. Observers, who had expected to witness either a close contest or a victory for traditional methods, instead saw their fundamental assumptions about combat effectiveness completely invalidated. The demonstration suggested that everything they thought they knew about fighting might be based on misconceptions and inefficiencies. The second challenger attempted to compensate for his predecessor's failure by adopting completely different tactics. Rather than relying on brute force, she specialized in precision techniques and tactical thinking that she believed would be more effective against someone whose own style emphasized these qualities. This approach proved equally unsuccessful, though for different reasons. Where the first challenger had been overwhelmed by superior technique, the second discovered that her own methods, refined though they were, represented only a subset of capabilities that her opponent had already mastered and transcended. Every tactic she employed was countered by responses that incorporated her own techniques while adding dimensions she had never considered. The third trial presented the most interesting challenge yet. The opponent was not a traditional Sith Lord, but a master of an exotic fighting discipline from a species that had developed combat methods completely independently of Force traditions. His alien physiology and unfamiliar techniques were intended to test adaptability and resourcefulness in ways that previous challengers could not. This encounter showcased the value of his years spent studying diverse combat traditions and working with Dashade partners. The alien techniques, while certainly exotic, followed principles that he had already encountered and learned to counter through his systematic exploration of non-force fighting methods. His responses demonstrated not just adaptability, but deep understanding of combat theory that transcended species-specific approaches. The pattern continued through subsequent challenges, each designed to test different aspects of his abilities, and each resulting in victories that seemed to expand rather than exhaust his capabilities. Opponents who specialized in force sorcery found their mystical attacks neutralized by techniques they had never imagined possible. Masters of environmental combat discovered that their chosen battlefields became advantages for someone who understood terrain dynamics better than they did. Perhaps most remarkably, the defeated challengers began experiencing something unprecedented in Sith culture. Rather than feeling humiliated by their losses, they found themselves intellectually fascinated by the techniques that had bested them. Several requested permission to study his methods, not as subordinates seeking to curry favor, but as fellow warriors genuinely interested in improving their own capabilities. This response represented a fundamental shift in Sith attitudes toward defeat and learning. Traditional culture viewed losing as shameful weakness that should be hidden or avenged. The trials were demonstrating that defeat could be educational, that understanding superior techniques was more valuable than maintaining pride based on ignorance. The Dashade observers who attended each trial added another dimension to the spectacle. Their presence served as living proof that his methods could earn loyalty from beings who had no obligation to serve anyone. Their obvious respect for his abilities provided independent validation of his superiority that could not be dismissed as political propaganda or personal favoritism. As the trials progressed and the challenges became increasingly difficult, a remarkable transformation occurred in the attitude of spectators. What had begun as entertainment for observers, expecting to witness his eventual defeat, evolved into educational opportunities that attracted serious students of combat from throughout the galaxy. The trials were becoming more than tests of individual prowess. They were serving as public demonstrations of principles and techniques that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of conflict, mastery, and achievement. Each victory provided lessons that extended far beyond combat applications, illustrating approaches to problem-solving and excellence that had implications for every aspect of civilized life. The opposition leaders who had initiated the trials found themselves in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Their plan to expose his weaknesses was instead showcasing his strengths before the largest possible audience. Each victory strengthened rather than weakened his reputation, while simultaneously making their own limitations more obvious through comparison. The final challenges would need to be something extraordinary, tests that could either prove their point about the inadequacy of his methods or definitively establish his supremacy beyond any possibility of future challenge. The stakes continued to rise as the trials approached their climactic conclusion. Victory, particularly victory achieved so comprehensively and repeatedly, brought with it consequences that even the most prescient observers could not have anticipated. As the trials concluded with his unquestioned supremacy established beyond any reasonable doubt, the galaxy found itself grappling with a new reality that challenged conventional understanding of power, leadership, and the nature of achievement itself. The immediate aftermath of the trial saw a transformation in how Sith society viewed conflict and competition. Traditional approaches that had seemed adequate for generations now appeared primitive and inefficient when compared to demonstrated alternatives. Warriors throughout Sith space began questioning their own training methods, seeking to understand how such obvious superiority had been achieved and whether similar improvements might be possible in their own development. This widespread re-evaluation created opportunities for unprecedented cooperation between former adversaries. Many of the Dark Lords who had challenged him during the trials requested formal instruction in his methods, not as defeated supplicants, but as peers genuinely interested in advancing their own capabilities. The ancient Sith tradition of regarding former enemies as permanent threats gave way to something resembling collegial respect based on shared commitment to excellence. Yet even as his influence expanded and his innovations gained broader acceptance, subtle changes began to manifest in his personal demeanor and daily routines. The relentless pursuit of perfection that had driven his remarkable achievements was exacting costs that became apparent only to those closest to him. His Dashade companions, with their millennia of experience in observing warrior development, were the first to recognize the symptoms. The same dedication that had enabled him to achieve impossible standards of technique was gradually isolating him from meaningful peer relationships. There were simply no other beings in the galaxy who could match his level of understanding or provide the kind of intellectual and martial challenges necessary for continued growth. Training sessions that had once been opportunities for mutual learning and development became solitary exercises in maintaining capabilities that no potential partner could effectively test or improve. The collaborative approach that had revolutionized Sith education worked beautifully for students seeking to reach his level, but offered little benefit to someone who had already transcended conventional limitations. The philosophical framework he had developed for understanding perfect hatred required constant refinement and application to remain effective. Without equals to challenge his thinking or peers capable of offering genuine criticism, he found himself relying increasingly on theoretical analysis rather than practical experimentation. The dynamic process of discovery that had characterized his early years was gradually being replaced by maintenance of existing knowledge. His Dashade allies recognized this development as a natural but potentially dangerous phase in the evolution of any master who achieved genuine supremacy in their chosen discipline. Their own cultural traditions included extensive lore about warriors who had reached similar levels of excellence and the various ways such individuals had responded to the isolation that inevitably accompanied absolute mastery. Some historical figures had withdrawn from active involvement in their societies, focusing their remaining years on preserving their knowledge for future generations. Others had sought new challenges in completely different fields, applying their understanding of excellence to endeavors far removed from their original specializations. A few had attempted to push beyond known limitations, pursuing innovations so advanced that they transcended the boundaries of conventional understanding. The Dashade observed their master carefully, ready to provide whatever support might be needed as he navigated this critical transition period. Their loyalty had evolved from simple respect for superior skill into something approaching familial devotion. They understood that his well-being was inseparable from the preservation of everything they had helped him achieve. His response to the challenges of supreme mastery revealed the depth of his character and the wisdom underlying his philosophical approach. Rather than withdrawing from active engagement or becoming bitter about his isolation, he began focusing his attention on questions that extended far beyond personal achievement. The archaeological discoveries that had provided historical context for his innovations took on new significance as he contemplated the long-term implications of his work. Ancient civilizations that had achieved remarkable levels of development before mysteriously disappearing suggested that even the most successful innovations could be lost if not properly preserved and transmitted to future generations. This realization led to an intensification of his efforts to document and systematize everything he had learned. The training protocols that had been developed through years of experimentation were refined into comprehensive educational programs that could be implemented effectively even without his direct supervision. The philosophical insights that had enabled his revolutionary approach to hatred and technique were articulated in forms that could be understood and applied by students of varying backgrounds and capabilities. Most importantly, he began preparing his Dashade companions for responsibilities that would extend far beyond his own lifetime. Their natural longevity and cultural commitment to service made them ideal guardians for the knowledge and techniques he had developed. However, this transition required them to evolve from loyal assistants into independent custodians capable of preserving and transmitting complex information across potentially vast spans of time. The process of preparing for this transformation proved both challenging and rewarding for all involved. The Dashade had to develop new skills in teaching and communication, abilities that their warrior culture had never emphasized. He had to learn to trust others with responsibilities that he had previously handled personally, accepting that perfection might not always be achievable, but that competent stewardship was preferable to allowing knowledge to die with him. These preparations were conducted with characteristic thoroughness and attention to detail. Comprehensive archives were established in multiple secure locations, containing not just written records, but also interactive training aids and preservation technologies designed to maintain their effectiveness across millennia. The Dashade were trained not just in the technical aspects of his innovations, but in the underlying principles that would allow them to adapt and apply his methods to circumstances that could not be anticipated. The establishment of these preservation systems created a form of immortality that transcended mere personal survival. Even if he were to die unexpectedly, his knowledge and techniques would continue to influence galactic development through the dedicated efforts of beings who understood both their value and their responsibility to future generations. Yet even as he planned for eventual succession, his daily routine continued with the same discipline and intensity that had characterized his entire adult life. Physical training sessions maintained the peak conditioning necessary for his combat abilities. Meditation periods preserved the mental clarity required for strategic thinking and philosophical development. Administrative duties ensured that his territories continued to prosper under his guidance. The combination of present responsibilities and future planning created a unique perspective on the nature of legacy and achievement. He came to understand that true mastery involved not just personal excellence, but the ability to ensure that such excellence could be perpetuated and improved by others. The greatest victory was not defeating all possible challenges, but creating conditions where future generations could surpass even his own accomplishments. This understanding brought a sense of peace that had been absent during his years of active striving. The restless drive for improvement that had propelled his early development evolved into something more sustainable and ultimately more satisfying. He had found a way to remain productive and engaged while accepting the natural limitations that mortality imposed on even the most exceptional individuals. The Dashade observed this transformation with deep satisfaction. Their master had successfully navigated the transition from ambitious student to supreme practitioner to wise teacher. The bond they had forged through shared commitment to excellence had evolved into a partnership capable of preserving and transmitting achievements that would influence the galaxy for generations beyond their own lifetimes. As the years passed, and his reputation continued to grow throughout Sith space and beyond, the foundation was being laid for a legacy that would transcend traditional concepts of political or military achievement. He was becoming something more than a Dark Lord or military commander. He was evolving into a custodian of knowledge whose influence would extend far beyond his own era, shaping the development of countless future generations through innovations that would prove both timeless and transformative. The end, when it came, arrived not with the violent betrayal that marked the downfall of so many Sith Lords, nor through the political machinations that typically concluded careers built on ambition and conquest. Instead, it unfolded as mysteriously as the man himself had lived, leaving questions that would puzzle historians and scholars for millennia to come. The first signs that something fundamental was changing appeared in subtle alterations to his daily routines that only his closest companions could detect. Training sessions that had maintained consistent patterns for decades began incorporating new elements that seemed to prepare for challenges that did not yet exist. Meditation periods extended far beyond their normal duration, often accompanied by expressions of deep concentration that suggested engagement with problems of extraordinary complexity. His Dashade guardians, attuned to every nuance of his behavior through years of intimate service, recognized these changes as significant departures from established norms. Their warrior instincts, honed through countless battles and refined through cultural traditions spanning millennia, detected an underlying tension that had not been present during even the most challenging periods of his rise to power. When questioned about these developments, he offered explanations that were both truthful and incomplete. He spoke of sensing disturbances in the Force that suggested approaching changes of galactic significance. He mentioned archaeological discoveries that hinted at cyclical patterns in galactic history, periods of advancement followed by collapse that seemed to repeat across vast spans of time. Most intriguingly, he began expressing concern about the long-term sustainability of the civilization he had worked so hard to improve. The prosperity and stability his methods had brought to Sith space were remarkable achievements, but they were also fragile accomplishments that depended on continued wise leadership and popular understanding of the principles underlying their success. His studies of ancient history had revealed numerous examples of advanced civilizations that had achieved remarkable heights before succumbing to internal decay or external catastrophe. The patterns were disturbingly consistent across different species, time periods, and galactic regions. Success bred complacency, prosperity weakened the discipline necessary to maintain it, and achievement created vulnerabilities that had not existed during the struggle to attain it. These concerns led to an intensification of his efforts to preserve and transmit the knowledge he had accumulated. Archives that had already been comprehensive were expanded to include even more detailed documentation of techniques, principles, and historical context. Training programs were refined to ensure they could function effectively even under adverse conditions or without direct supervision from master-level instructors. The Dashade were given expanded responsibilities that transformed them from loyal servants into independent custodians of an intellectual and cultural heritage. They were taught not just the practical applications of his innovations, but the underlying philosophical framework that had made those innovations possible. Most importantly, they were prepared to serve as bridges between his era and whatever future circumstances might emerge. These preparations were conducted with an urgency that suggested he sensed time was running short, though no external threats or internal health problems were apparent to outside observers. His physical condition remained excellent, his mental faculties as sharp as ever, his political position more secure than it had ever been. Yet something was driving him to complete projects and resolve issues with a thoroughness that seemed to anticipate an approaching conclusion. The mystery deepened when routine communications from his territories began mentioning unusual astronomical phenomena that were visible only from specific locations within his domain. Ancient Sith observatories that had been dormant for centuries suddenly showed signs of activation. Star charts were updated to reflect celestial alignments that occurred only at intervals measured in millennia. Scholars familiar with ancient Sith lore recognized these developments as potentially connected to prophetic traditions that had been largely forgotten in contemporary times. References existed in the oldest texts to cosmic events that supposedly marked transitions between great ages of galactic history. These passages had been dismissed by most modern analysts as primitive superstition, but the apparent correlation with current observations suggested they might contain more truth than previously assumed. His final public appearance took place during a gathering of representatives from throughout his territories, a celebration of achievements that had transformed entire star systems and influenced development across much of known space. His address to the assembled dignitaries was both a summation of past accomplishments and a guide for future development that could function independently of his continued presence. The speech itself became legendary for its combination of practical wisdom and prophetic insight. He outlined principles for maintaining the prosperity and stability his methods had created, while also preparing his listeners for challenges that had not yet manifested, but which his understanding of historical patterns suggested were inevitable. Most remarkably, he spoke of his work not as personal achievement, but as part of a larger pattern of knowledge that appeared and disappeared across galactic history, according to cycles that transcended individual lifetimes or civilizations. He positioned himself as a temporary custodian of insights that belonged to all sentient beings capable of understanding and applying them responsibly. The final weeks of his active life were spent in intensive consultation with his Dashade companions, reviewing and refining the arrangements that would preserve his legacy after his departure. These discussions were conducted with a calm purposefulness that suggested he had accepted whatever fate awaited him and was focused entirely on ensuring continuity for the work he had begun. Contemporary accounts of his final days describe a strange serenity that seemed almost supernatural in its completeness. The intense drive that had characterized his entire adult life gave way to a peaceful satisfaction that suggested he had accomplished everything he had set out to achieve. His last interactions with colleagues and students were marked by expressions of gratitude for their contributions to shared endeavors and confidence in their ability to carry forward what had been begun together. The exact circumstances of his death remain one of the great mysteries of Sith history. He was discovered in his private chambers, apparently having died peacefully in his sleep, with no signs of violence, poison, or external interference. Medical examination revealed no obvious cause of death, suggesting that his passing resulted from natural causes despite his relatively young age and excellent physical condition. More puzzling were the conditions surrounding the discovery of his body. His Dashade guardians, whose vigilance had never wavered during years of faithful service, reported no unusual disturbances during the night. Security systems showed no evidence of intrusion or unauthorized access. Yet the chamber itself displayed subtle signs of disturbance that suggested some form of activity had occurred after his death. Personal effects were found arranged in patterns that seemed significant, but whose meaning could not be immediately determined. Documents that had been scattered across his desk were organized into neat stacks, as if someone had been reviewing and organizing them. Most mysteriously, several items that should have been present according to detailed inventories were missing, though no means of removal could be identified. The Dashade response to their master's death provided the most intriguing clues about what had actually occurred. Rather than displaying the grief or confusion that might have been expected, they demonstrated a calm purposefulness that suggested they had been prepared for this eventuality. Their immediate actions focused on implementing preservation protocols that had been established during his final weeks, as if following carefully rehearsed procedures. When questioned about the missing items and unusual arrangements, the Dashade offered explanations that were technically accurate but somehow incomplete. They spoke of final instructions that had been carried out exactly as specified, of responsibilities that had been transferred according to predetermined plans, of continuity measures that ensured his work would continue without interruption. Yet their manner suggested knowledge of additional details that they were either unable or unwilling to share. Their loyalty to their deceased master appeared to extend to protecting secrets that he had entrusted to them alone, mysteries that would remain hidden unless future circumstances made their revelation necessary for the preservation of his legacy. The immediate aftermath of his death saw none of the chaos or power struggles that typically followed the demise of major Sith Lords. His territories continued to function smoothly under the administrative systems he had established. His students and colleagues maintained the collaborative relationships he had fostered. Most remarkably, his innovations continued to spread throughout the galaxy as if guided by some invisible hand that ensured their proper development and application. The construction of his tomb began not after his death, but during the final months of his life, undertaken as a collaborative project between himself and his Dashade guardians. This was no ordinary sepulchre, designed merely to house mortal remains, but rather a complex architectural achievement that embodied the same principles of perfect technique and purposeful design that had characterized all his endeavors. The location chosen for this monument was itself significant, positioned within the Valley of the Dark Lords on Corrigan, but situated to take advantage of unique geological and astronomical features that had been largely ignored by previous tomb builders. The site aligned with celestial phenomena that occurred according to ancient cycles, incorporating considerations of force, energy flow, and environmental harmony that reflected his deep understanding of both natural law and mystical principle. The design incorporated innovations that bridged the gap between traditional Sith architectural conventions and entirely new approaches to construction and functionality. External features honored the aesthetic expectations associated with Dark Lord monuments, ensuring the tomb would be recognized and respected according to established cultural norms. However, internal arrangements reflected purposes that extended far beyond conventional burial practices. The Dashade involvement in every aspect of planning and construction created something unprecedented in Sith tomb architecture. Their natural abilities allowed for the incorporation of hidden passages and concealed chambers that would be virtually invisible to normal detection methods. Their understanding of stealth and security enabled defensive measures that could protect the tomb's contents without relying on the crude mechanical traps or mystical guardians typically employed for such purposes. Most remarkably, the tomb was designed to function as a teaching facility rather than simply a memorial monument. The chambers contained interactive elements that could provide instruction in his techniques and philosophical insights to worthy visitors, while simultaneously testing their understanding and commitment to ensure only serious students gained access to advanced knowledge. The central burial chamber represented the culmination of architectural innovation applied to spiritual purpose. The placement of his sarcophagus utilized principles of force-energy manipulation that had been discovered through his archaeological research, creating conditions that might preserve not just physical remains, but aspects of consciousness that could continue to influence future generations. The Dashade preparation for their new role as eternal guardians involved cultural adaptations that transformed their traditional understanding of service and loyalty. Their species had always honored commitments across multiple generations, but the bond they had formed with their master required devotion that would potentially span millennia rather than merely decades or centuries. This transition was facilitated by their natural longevity and cultural emphasis on duty that transcended personal considerations. However, it also required them to develop new capabilities in education, communication, and cultural preservation that extended far beyond their traditional warrior specializations. They had to become scholars and teachers while maintaining their effectiveness as protectors and guardians. The knowledge they were entrusted to preserve encompassed not just combat techniques and force applications, but the entire philosophical framework that had made those innovations possible. They learned to recognize and evaluate potential students, to determine appropriate levels of instruction for individuals with varying backgrounds and capabilities, and to adapt teaching methods to accommodate different learning styles and cultural contexts. The establishment of their guardianship coincided with the implementation of preservation technologies that ensured the tomb's contents would remain intact and functional across vast spans of time. Environmental controls maintained optimal conditions for both organic and technological materials. Defensive systems provided protection against natural disasters, unauthorized intrusion, and the gradual degradation that threatened most ancient sites. These systems were designed with characteristic attention to both immediate functionality and long-term sustainability. Backup mechanisms ensured continued operation even if primary systems failed. Redundant preservation methods protected against loss due to unforeseen circumstances. Most importantly, maintenance procedures were established that could be performed by the Dashade guardians without requiring external technological support. The completion of the tomb marked a transformation in the relationship between the Dashade and their master's legacy. They were no longer simply loyal servants carrying out instructions, but independent custodians responsible for making complex decisions about how best to preserve and transmit the knowledge they had been entrusted to protect. This evolution required them to develop judgment and wisdom that complemented their existing strengths in combat and stealth. They had to learn to evaluate the motivations and capabilities of potential students to determine when sharing knowledge would advance their master's purposes and when secrecy would better serve those same goals. The early years of their guardianship established patterns and precedents that would guide their actions for generations to come. Visitors to the tomb discovered that access to its treasures was not determined by political authority or payment of tribute, but by demonstrated understanding of the principles their master had valued most highly. Students who approached with genuine desire to learn and commitment to excellence found themselves welcomed and instructed according to their individual needs and capabilities. Those who came seeking shortcuts to power or superficial knowledge of advanced techniques discovered that the tomb's defenses could be more intimidating than any conventional security measures. The Dashade's approach to their educational responsibilities reflected the same philosophy of perfection through disciplined effort that had characterized their master's teaching methods. They provided comprehensive instruction to worthy students while maintaining standards that ensured only serious practitioners gained access to the most advanced knowledge. This selective approach to knowledge dissemination created a form of quality control that preserved the integrity of the techniques and insights they were protecting. Rather than allowing his innovations to be corrupted through careless application or misunderstanding, they ensured that each generation of students maintained the same commitment to excellence that had made those innovations possible. The influence of the tomb extended far beyond its immediate vicinity, as students who completed training there carried their knowledge to distant corners of the galaxy. These graduates served as seeds for the continued development and application of his techniques, creating networks of practitioners who maintained connection to the original source while adapting the methods to their own circumstances and challenges. The Dashade monitored these dispersed applications of their master's knowledge through intelligence networks that had been established during his lifetime. This ongoing surveillance allowed them to identify promising developments and intervene when necessary to prevent corruptions or misapplications that might damage the reputation of techniques they were sworn to protect. Over time, the tomb became recognized throughout Sith space and beyond as a unique educational resource whose value transcended political boundaries and cultural differences. Warriors from diverse backgrounds and species made pilgrimages to Korriban specifically to seek instruction from guardians whose dedication and expertise had become legendary. The reputation of the Dashade themselves evolved from that of mysterious servants to recognition as masters in their own right, teachers whose insights and capabilities complemented and enhanced the preserved wisdom of their original master. They developed their own teaching traditions and methodologies, while remaining faithful to the fundamental principles they had been entrusted to preserve. This evolution created something unprecedented in galactic history, an educational institution that maintained consistent quality and purpose across multiple generations. While adapting to changing circumstances and student populations, the tomb became a bridge between ancient wisdom and contemporary application, ensuring that valuable knowledge remained relevant and accessible despite the passage of time. The bond between the Dashade and their master's legacy strengthened rather than weakened over the generations. Each successful student validated their commitment to his vision. Every innovation that built upon his foundation confirmed the value of their guardianship. Most importantly, the continued effectiveness of his techniques in addressing new challenges demonstrated that their preservation efforts were serving purposes that extended far beyond mere historical curiosity. The Dashade discovered that their role as guardians provided opportunities for continued growth and development that their traditional warrior culture could never have offered. They became scholars, teachers, philosophers, and innovators while maintaining their effectiveness as protectors and preservers of ancient knowledge. Their commitment to their master's memory evolved into something approaching religious devotion, not to his person, but to the principles and achievements he represented. They saw themselves as servants of excellence itself, guardians of the possibility that all sentient beings could transcend their limitations through dedicated effort and proper understanding. The tomb stood as testament to the power of loyalty that transcended death, of knowledge that could survive the passage of millennia, and of bonds forged through shared commitment to ideals that proved stronger than the forces that typically separated different species and cultures. In the deepest chambers of the monument, where few were permitted to venture, the Dashade maintained vigils that connected them directly to their master's presence in ways that outsiders could never fully comprehend. There, in the shadows that had become their permanent home, they continued conversations that death had interrupted but not ended, receiving guidance for challenges that had not existed during his lifetime. The eternal shadow bond had become reality, a partnership that would endure as long as the galaxy itself continued to turn beneath ancient stars. Time flowed onward, like the ancient desert winds of Korriban, carrying with it the echoes of ages past and the whispers of futures yet unborn. In the Valley of the Dark Lords, where crimson stone monuments reached towards stars that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, one tomb stood apart from all others, not for its grandeur or the fear it inspired, but for the peace that emanated from its shadowed halls. The years became decades, and decades merged into centuries. Yet the guardianship of the Dashade remained as steadfast as the day they had first pledged their loyalty to a master whose vision had transcended the limitations of his era. Their vigil had evolved from simple protection of physical remains into something far more profound and enduring, a living connection between ancient wisdom and the ever-changing needs of a galaxy in constant flux. Pilgrims continued to arrive at the tomb, drawn by stories that had grown into legends, legends that had crystallized into truths that spoke to the deepest aspirations of sentient beings everywhere. Warriors seeking to perfect their craft discovered techniques that challenged everything they thought they knew about combat and competition. Scholars pursuing understanding found philosophical frameworks that illuminated mysteries they had struggled with for lifetimes. Most remarkably, students from species that had never known the touch of the Force learned that excellence was not limited to those blessed with supernatural abilities. The integration of Dashade methods with traditional training created opportunities for beings of all backgrounds to achieve levels of mastery that had previously seemed impossible. The influence of these teachings spread far beyond the confines of Sith space, carried by graduates who applied their knowledge in contexts that their ancient master could never have imagined. Medical practitioners discovered that the principles of perfect technique could revolutionize surgical procedures and diagnostic methods. Engineers found that the philosophy of disciplined hatred could drive innovations that solved problems once considered intractable. Artists and craftsmen learned that the pursuit of flawless execution could elevate their work from mere skill to transcendent beauty. Teachers and leaders discovered that the collaborative methods developed in those ancient training halls could transform entire educational systems and governmental structures. The ripple effects of a single being's commitment to excellence had become waves of influence that touched every aspect of galactic civilization. Yet perhaps the most significant impact was not in any specific technique or innovation, but in the fundamental shift in how beings understood the relationship between individual achievement and collective benefit. The traditional assumption that personal success necessarily came at the expense of others was gradually being replaced by recognition that true mastery created value that could be shared without diminishment. The zero-sum thinking that had characterized so many civilizations gave way to collaborative approaches that multiplied rather than divided available opportunities. In the quiet chambers of the tomb, where Dashade guardians maintained their eternal watch, this transformation was both celebrated and carefully monitored. Their responsibility extended beyond simply preserving ancient knowledge to ensuring that its application served the highest purposes their master had envisioned. They observed with satisfaction as former enemies learned to work together, as competitive instincts were channeled into collective improvement, as the pursuit of individual excellence became a force for universal betterment. These developments validated their conviction that the principles they protected contained wisdom that was truly timeless and universally applicable. The tomb itself had become more than a memorial, or even an educational facility. It had evolved into a symbol of the possibility that death need not mean the end of influence, that properly preserved knowledge could continue to serve beneficial purposes across spans of time that dwarfed individual lifetimes. Visitors often commented on the atmosphere of serenity that pervaded the entire structure, a sense of peaceful purpose that seemed to radiate from the very stones. The Dashade explained that this tranquility reflected their master's final achievement, the recognition that true immortality lay not in extending physical existence, but in creating positive changes that would outlast any conceivable lifespan. The desert winds that swept across Korriban carried with them the whispers of countless stories, tales of beings who had visited the tomb and returned to their homes transformed by what they had learned. These stories spoke of techniques that seemed almost magical in their effectiveness, of philosophical insights that resolved conflicts that had seemed intractable, of hope restored to communities that had lost faith in the possibility of positive change. Yet for all the remarkable achievements and continuing influence, perhaps the most beautiful aspect of the legacy was its essential humility. The knowledge preserved in the tomb was offered freely to any who demonstrated genuine commitment to learning and growth. No payment was required, no political allegiance demanded, no religious conversion expected. The only currency accepted was sincere dedication to excellence and willingness to use acquired knowledge for purposes that honored the spirit of service that had motivated its original development. This approach ensured that the most powerful techniques remained in the hands of those most likely to use them responsibly and beneficially. As the galaxy continued its ancient dance around the galactic core, with civilizations rising and falling according to patterns that seemed as eternal as the stars themselves, the tomb stood as a constant reminder that some achievements could transcend the normal cycles of creation and destruction. The Dashade Guardians, now masters in their own right, and teachers whose reputation rivaled that of their original mentor, maintained their vigil with pride that was tempered by deep understanding of the responsibilities they carried. They knew that they were not merely preserving the past, but actively shaping the future through every student they taught and every principle they helped others understand. In the deepest meditation chambers, where silence was so complete that visitors could hear their own heartbeats, the presence of the ancient master could still be felt by those sensitive enough to perceive it, not as a ghost or spirit seeking to interfere with the living world, but as a gentle influence that provided guidance to those facing challenges that required wisdom beyond their current understanding. The Dashade spoke of conversations that continued across the boundary between life and death, discussions about new developments in galactic civilization and how ancient principles might be applied to contemporary challenges. These communications were not mystical experiences available only to Force users, but practical consultations that helped them fulfill their educational responsibilities more effectively. The eternal shadow bond had proven to be exactly that, a connection that neither time nor death could weaken, a partnership that continued to serve purposes greater than any individual ambitions or desires. Through their dedication, the influence of a single exceptional being had become a permanent part of galactic heritage, a source of inspiration and practical guidance that would endure as long as sentient beings sought to transcend their limitations. As the ancient stars wheeled overhead in their eternal patterns, casting pale light across the tombs and monuments of Korriban's Valley of the Dark Lords, one structure stood as testament to the possibility that true greatness lay not in domination or accumulation of power, but in service to ideals that could elevate all who encountered them. The tomb slept peacefully under the desert sky, its guardians alert and ready, its treasures intact and waiting for the next worthy student to arrive, seeking the kind of transformation that could only be achieved through patient dedication to the pursuit of perfect mastery. In this quiet persistence, in this eternal readiness to serve and teach and guide, lay perhaps the greatest victory of all, the triumph of wisdom over ignorance, of hope over despair, of the enduring belief that tomorrow could always be better than today, if enough beings committed themselves to making it so. The story continued, as it always had and always would, in the choices made by those who learned from the past while building toward a future worthy of the sacrifices made by those who had come before. And in the shadows that danced between the ancient stones, patient guardians waited, ready to share the gifts they had been entrusted to preserve, knowing that their vigil served purposes that extended far beyond their own understanding, purposes that connected them to the eternal dance of learning, growing, and becoming that defined the very essence of life itself. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the ages, through the remarkable story of Tulak Hord, the Lord of Hate, who taught the galaxy that true power comes not from conquest, but from the patient pursuit of excellence, shared freely with any who seek to learn. If you enjoyed this exploration of ancient legends and galactic mysteries, please consider subscribing to continue these journeys together. Until next time, may your own pursuits lead you toward the kind of mastery that serves not just yourself, but all those whose lives you touch. Rest well, and dream of distant stars, where ancient wisdom waits to guide those brave enough to seek it.